They didn't want you to find it, not because it was false, but because it was too true. There was once a prayer, short, quiet, hidden between lines that no longer exist in the printed pages you grew up reading. A prayer that didn't beg, didn't flatter, didn't plead for forgiveness. A prayer that didn't ask God to save you, but reminded you that you already were. And for centuries, it lived in silence, buried in apocryphal fragments, burned papyri, whispered fragments in the margins of dead languages, until one day it disappeared, not lost, removed, and no one talked about it again. But it's coming back now, not because someone found it in a vault, but because you're ready to hear it. You've felt it, haven't you? That strange ache, that spiritual static in the background of your mind, that feeling that there's something you were meant to know, but every time you reached for it, the noise got louder. That wasn't coincidence. That was interference. Because if you ever remembered who you really are, what you really carry, this system wouldn't work anymore. Not the religious system, not the political one, not the psychological script that taught you to worship from fear. All of it depends on you never remembering. Let's go back. According to a letter discovered in 1889, never authenticated, quietly dismissed, a Syrian monk named Theophilus wrote of a dangerous utterance that had been passed down orally since the 1st century. It wasn't written in Greek, not in Latin. It was carved into cedar, passed hand to hand, recited in caves under threat of death by those who believed that God did not live in temples, but inside the breath. Theophilus wrote, "This is the prayer that opens the eye of the soul. It is short, and it does not ask. It declares." That's why it had to be erased, because it didn't make you obedient. It made you awake. Imagine a prayer that didn't start with "Our Father," but with "I remember." Imagine a line that didn't end with "Deliver me," but with "I was never bound." And most dangerously, imagine a prayer that said, "The kingdom is not coming. It's already here, in me." That's not religion, that's rebellion. And rebellion from within is what scares systems the most. Because you can't change someone who no longer believes they were born guilty. You can't control someone who knows they are already whole. You can't sell salvation to someone who's not lost. So they erased it, one syllable at a time, one generation at a time, until all that was left were sanitized verses, approved rituals, and a God so far away you forgot he was ever inside you. They gave you a script, one that made you small, and they called that humility, but it wasn't humility. It was disempowerment disguised as devotion. And that's why you've always felt off, because something in your body remembers. A sentence you've never read, a vibration you've never been taught, a fire you've been told to fear. This video isn't just about history, it's about recovery. Not of doctrine, but of your direct access. Because once you hear the full version of this prayer, once you understand what it meant and why it was silenced, you won't be able to go back to the performance. Not the spiritual performance, not the emotional mask, not the obedient child version of you who asked permission to exist. You'll understand why your fatigue runs so deep, why your soul has been restless, why you've spent your whole life seeking what was never lost. You're not about to learn something new. You're about to remember what was stolen. Let's begin. They couldn't just remove the prayer. They had to remove your ability to even look for it, because a hidden truth is only dangerous if someone remembers it existed. So they built a system, layer by layer, designed not to imprison your body, but your awareness. And it worked. You grew up learning about obedience, not resonance. You were taught to fear blasphemy more than you were taught to listen to. Your soul. You learned that asking too many questions was rebellion, that reverence meant silence, that worship meant distance, and slowly your spiritual compass was handed over to someone else, a priest, a book, a doctrine, a hierarchy. And in that exchange, something sacred was lost. Not your faith, but your direct access. Because access is power, and power was never meant to be distributed. They needed you to believe that the sacred was elsewhere, that holiness was reserved, that authority was external. So they gave you rituals to memorize, songs to sing, postures to kneel in, words to repeat, even when your heart was silent. And you performed, because you were told that performing was believing. You bowed, you confessed, you served. But somewhere in the quiet corners of your soul you kept asking, is this all there is? Why does this feel hollow? Why do I feel further from God the more I obey? The answer: because obedience was never the goal of your spirit. Remembrance was. And remembrance doesn't require a system. It requires permission to feel. But feeling, that deep, untamed inner knowing, is the greatest threat to a system built on control. So they taught you not to feel, not deeply. They made emotion something to fear. They labeled ecstasy as heresy. They buried intuition beneath fear of punishment. Because the moment you feel deeply enough, you remember. You remember your worth, your knowing, your divinity. And when you remember that, you become uncontrollable. Let's be clear, this didn't happen overnight. It was an orchestration. They didn't erase the prayer with fire. They erased it with curriculum. They turned mystery into dogma, revelation into memorization, inner fire into outer ritual. You were trained not to hear, not to question, not to go inward. You were given a God so far away, you forgot you were part of Him. And then they sold you the map to a place you never left. That's the programming, not to disbelieve, but to never even consider that there was more. To dismiss your dreams, to suppress your visions, to medicate your intuition, to mock your silence, to replace your inner knowing with second-hand instruction. And they called that faith. But real faith isn't submission, it's connection. And connection, they can't be commodified, so they buried it. But you feel it now, don't you? That flicker, that pulse, that strange ache when you're alone and everything gets quiet. You can't explain it. It doesn't fit the theology you were taught, but it's there, persistent, familiar. It's the sound of something ancient inside you, trying to surface. Not a belief, a reminder of something you never read in a book, of something no one taught you, of something that has been trying to reach you since the first time you were told to stay silent in church. And that's why this prayer matters. Not because it's magical, not because it unlocks riches or protection, but because it's a trigger, a sentence that reactivates your memory, a string of words so simple it bypasses the walls they built in your mind and goes straight to your soul. It doesn't teach you anything new. It whispers what you already knew before the programming, before the conditioning, before the shame, before the fear that told you to be small so you could be safe. They didn't just erase the prayer, they erased the language inside you that could have recognized it. They took your power by taking your remembrance. But that ends now, because you're not here by accident. You didn't click this video by coincidence, and you're not drawn to this message for entertainment. You're here because something in you is ready to wake up, not to rebellion, not to new rules, but to the truth that you were always connected. They just taught you to forget. Let's continue. It was short, that was part of its power. While other prayers became long, elaborate, and layered with praise, apology, and hierarchy, this one was bare, unfiltered, undomesticated. It didn't ask for forgiveness, it didn't beg for safety, it didn't seek favor. It declared something forbidden. I was not made to be ruled. The breath within me is holy. The kingdom is now, and I am its gate. I do not need to be saved. I only need to remember. No one knew exactly where it originated. Some said it was a teaching passed orally by early desert mystics, spiritual rebels who left the cities when doctrine began to replace direct communion. Others believed it came from a sect of early followers who were silenced before history could name them. A few ancient Syriac letters even mention a version of it being sung, not spoken, in minor key, under moonlight, during hidden gatherings where no one led and no one followed. But wherever it came from, the effect was always the same. People who heard it changed, not just emotionally, energetically, biologically. They stopped performing. They stopped asking permission. They stopped fearing silence. And most dangerously, they stopped needing the system. The full version, reconstructed from fractured manuscripts, oral tradition, and suppressed letters, might have sounded like this. I remember. I was not born in sin. I was born in light. I was not made to serve empires, but to walk with the divine. I am not distant. I am not lost. I am not waiting. The breath in me is sacred. The fire in me is truth. The silence in me is God. I no longer bow to shadows. I rise because I am already whole. To the systems of control, this was a spiritual virus. Because if even a small number of people began to repeat this, to believe it, to live it, they would no longer fear excommunication. They would no longer be guilted into obedience. They would no longer pour their energy into hierarchies that feed on insecurity. They would stop needing to be told who they are, because they would remember, and a human being who remembers is the most dangerous thing of all. That's why it was buried. Not because it was heresy, but because it was liberation. Because liberation doesn't require war. It doesn't demand protest. It just requires people to stop playing the role they were trained to perform, to stop kneeling from shame, to stop reciting scripts they never wrote, to stop shrinking just to be accepted. This prayer wasn't designed to stir rebellion. It was designed to end dependency. And nothing threatens a system of spiritual commerce more than someone who doesn't need to buy back their worth. You see the pattern, don't you? How every empire, every institution that sells salvation must first convince you that you are damned by default. How they must teach you that access is earned, that wholeness is conditional, that God is distant, and they are the translator. This is the formula. And this prayer breaks the formula. It doesn't just change what you say, it changes what you feel when you speak. Not fear, not guilt, but resonance. It reconnects your voice to your own source. And once that happens, you don't forget. There's a reason mystics were persecuted. Not because they threatened doctrine, but because they threatened dependency. Because when you find God not in a building but in your breath, you stop obeying out of fear. You start living from a place they can't touch, a place that doesn't panic when others disapprove, a place that doesn't flinch when you're misunderstood, a place that doesn't collapse when your external world shakes, because you no longer need to be approved when you remember you were never broken. That's what this prayer restores, not a belief, a posture, a frequency, a presence. So yes, they erased it from the texts, from the teachings, from the mainstream history of your faith, but they didn't erase it from the field, the deep field of knowing that exists under your conditioning. That's why it's resurfacing now. Not because someone found it, but because you're ready to recognize it. Because this isn't about ancient history. It's about what you're reclaiming right now. Let's keep going. They didn't just remove the prayer, they replaced the space it left behind with fear. You weren't just disconnected from the divine within you, you were trained to fear it. Because when someone removes your power, they can't leave you empty. They have to fill the void with something else. So they filled it with guilt, with shame, with the subtle suggestion that your own intuition was dangerous, that silence was suspect, that stillness was seduction, that confidence was pride, and over time you started looking away from yourself for the answers you used to feel inside. They told you to distrust your emotions, to override your gut, to doubt your desires, to separate spiritual from human. You were taught that your body was fallen, that your thoughts were sinful, that your longings were proof of corruption. And so you learned to flinch at your own reflection, not because you were arrogant, but because you were told that closeness to yourself was closeness to sin, and closeness to sin meant distance from God. So what did you do? You built your identity around rejection of self. You called it humility, but it was just rehearsed self-abandonment. Every time you felt the pull to question, you silenced it. Every time you felt the pulse of truth, that you dismissed it. Every time your soul whispered, "Remember me," you responded with louder rituals because you thought distance equaled safety. But safety at the cost of self isn't holiness, it's erasure. And erasure is the goal of any system that needs you to stay dependent, because the moment you trust your soul, you stop needing their version of God. That's why they trained you to fear your own knowing. They needed you to see the divine as something outside of you, so they could position themselves as the gatekeepers. They told you your heart was deceitful, that your instincts were unreliable, that your imagination was rebellion. But what if your imagination was the voice of God trying to reach you through the only channel you still hadn't blocked? What if your emotions were your internal compass telling you when something was off? What if your silence wasn't emptiness, but sacred instruction? You've performed long enough, the bowing, the smiling, the emotional labor of pretending you believe things you no longer feel. They told you faith was about reverence, but what they really taught you was how to perform for approval. You prayed to be seen. You confessed to feel clean. You sang what others sang, not because it moved you, but because silence felt suspicious. You didn't connect. You complied, and compliance was praised. The quieter you became, the more spiritual you were considered. But that silence wasn't peace, it was suppression. They told you obedience was strength, but you know what obedience really is? It's a shortcut to belonging. It's the currency you traded for acceptance in a system that only loves you when you play your role. And so you became a version of yourself they could tolerate. You dressed the part, spoke the language, pretended that doubt was the enemy, when in fact, doubt was the door to your own awakening. But doors like that scare people, because once you open one, you start seeing all the others, and suddenly you're not trapped anymore. You're choosing. And that kind of freedom? It's unforgivable to a system built on fear. So you were taught to shut the doors, to reject mystery, to avoid the edge, to fear the wildness within you. You became polite, clean, acceptable, but you lost something in the process. Your wildness, your flame, your clarity. And without clarity, obedience became easier than truth. You weren't following God. You were following scripts, and the worst part? You thought that was normal, but deep down you knew. You felt it in the sermons that didn't land, in the prayers that echoed with emptiness, in the rules that punished honesty, and in the sacred moments when you were alone, no one watching, and your body still whispered, "This isn't it. You're more than this. Come home." You weren't losing your faith. You were outgrowing your programming. And the moment you admit that, you stop performing. You start remembering, you stop obeying, you start embodying, and that is the beginning of everything. There's always a moment, a quiet breaking. It doesn't happen on a mountaintop. It doesn't come with lightning. It arrives in the middle of a Tuesday when you're doing something ordinary, brushing your teeth, folding laundry, answering an email, and suddenly you feel the script snap. It's subtle, but irreversible. You realize that you can't go back. Not because you're angry, not because you're rebellious, but because something inside you just stopped pretending. The performance collapses, and all that's left is you, raw, unmasked, undeniable. At first, it's terrifying. You feel like you're floating in space, cut loose from every identity you've ever clung to. Who are you if you don't believe what you were taught? Who are you if you don't speak the language of the tribe? Who are you without the rituals, the rules, the roles? You've never been here before. This space between indoctrination and embodiment. It's disorienting, but also strangely familiar. Because for the first time in years, your soul isn't fighting you. It's exhaling. Because it knows this isn't a crisis of faith. It's a return to truth. And truth doesn't scream, it whispers. You begin to notice the silence feels different now, not empty, alive. Your prayers begin to change, not in content, but in vibration. You stop asking, you start listening, you stop begging to be saved, you start remembering that you already are. You're not walking away from God, you're walking away from the performance of Him. And the moment you let go of that performance, something ancient stirs inside you. It's not doctrine, it's not certainty, it's a frequency. One you haven't felt since you were a child staring at the sky, before anyone told you how to speak to heaven. And then, without warning, the prayer returns. Not as a scroll, not as a quote, but as a feeling. A sentence that begins in your bones long before it reaches your lips. You're not reciting, you're remembering. It doesn't come from your intellect. It comes from the field beneath language, the place where memory becomes resonance. It sounds like this: I am not missing. I was never disconnected. The breath in me is the breath of the beginning. I remember, and in that remembering I return. You don't find this prayer in books. You don't need to, because it lives in your presence. And now, you're finally present enough to hear it. You start to walk differently. Not because your theology changed, but because your center shifted. You start making eye contact again. With people, with the mirror, with your own soul. You start trusting your pause. You stop filling silence with noise. You start feeling truth in your body before it ever reaches your brain. And that's when you realize this prayer was never erased. It was only hidden beneath the noise of the person you were trained to be. And now that the performance has ended, you don't need permission to speak it. You just need to live it. Because living it is how you pass it on. They'll try to pull you back, not because they're evil, but because your alignment threatens their illusion. People who are still in the system will feel your clarity like an earthquake. They won't always know why, they'll just feel uncomfortable, challenged, unsettled. They might call you arrogant, detached, cold, prideful. But what they're really feeling is the discomfort of someone who can't be manipulated. And in a world built on emotional control, that kind of person is dangerous. But here's what they don't understand. You're not rejecting them. You're rejecting the script they handed you. You're no longer playing the role of the always agreeable, always available, always performing version of yourself. You've stopped trading authenticity for approval. You've stopped bleeding to prove your goodness. And in doing so, you've become untouchable. Not because you're hard, but because you're whole. And wholeness isn't easy to control. So yes, they'll test you. They'll bait you. They'll try to provoke the old you. But the old you doesn't live here anymore. You're not reactive. You're rooted. You don't explain. You exist. You don't attack. You withhold access. That's the new protection, not walls wide, but vibration. You don't argue your truth. You walk in it. You don't convert people. You confuse them. Because peace this deep is unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity scares those who still need chaos to feel alive. But you're no longer available for chaos, no longer addicted to proving your worth, no longer seeking salvation in rooms you had to betray yourself to stay in. You don't beg for space. You create it. You don't ask for clarity. You become it. And that's the kind of prayer that cannot be erased. They never imagined you'd make it this far, not because you were weak, but because the programming was deep, persistent, elegant in its subtlety. They built the system to feel like safety, to feel like home, to feel like love, so that when you left it, you wouldn't feel free. You'd feel guilty. And guilt is a powerful leash. It doesn't need chains, it doesn't need guards. It just needs your memory to be tied to their script with enough shame to make you turn back on your own. But you didn't turn back. You felt the guilt. You held the grief. You walked through the silence. And you kept walking. That's how systems fall. Not through violence, but through uninterrupted clarity. They trained you to feel responsible for everyone's comfort but your own. So when you stopped conforming, they called you selfish. They called you proud. They said you'd changed. And they were right. You had changed. Not into something new, but into something original. Something prescript. Something real. The shift isn't dramatic. It's quiet. You wake up and the rules don't apply the same way anymore. You stop responding to manipulation. You stop explaining your no. You stop translating your truth into language they can accept. You just live. And in doing so, you expose the system for what it always was. A machine that depended on your forgetting. A mechanism of shame masquerading as community. A cage that disguised itself as a holy temple. But now you see the hinges. You see the cracks. You see that the bars were made of ideas and not iron. So what do you do when you no longer belong to what once defined you? You don't fight it. You outgrow it. You stop trying to be heard and start listening to something older than opinion. You no longer need agreement to feel grounded. You no longer need applause to feel seen. You're not trying to be understood. You're trying to stay in alignment. And that alignment, it becomes your rhythm, your shield, your signal. You don't debate your truth, you become it. Now people come to you differently. They don't ask for answers, they ask for presence. They sit in your quiet and feel permission to question everything. And not because you preached, but because your energy says it's safe to stop pretending. You don't need to perform here. You're not broken, you're remembering. This isn't rebellion, it's return. And that kind of presence can't be erased, can't be burned, can't be edited from holy books, because it doesn't live on pages, it lives in people who remember. The prayer wasn't erased because it threatened theology, it was erased because it threatened control. Because if you don't believe you're broken, you stop begging for someone to fix you. If you don't believe God is far, you stop giving your power away to the ones who claim to represent Him. If you remember that the kingdom is not above you, but within you, you stop waiting to be saved and start living like you're whole. That's the legacy they buried, not words, not verses, not doctrine, but a way of being so radical it made hierarchies unnecessary. And that's the real danger, isn't it? A person who doesn't need saving can't be sold a savior. A person who feels God in their breath won't buy Him in a building. A person who remembers their divinity can't be ruled by fear. So they silenced it, not all at once, but piece by piece, with translations that favored obedience, with sermons that shamed embodiment, with doctrines that exalted distance and demonized intimacy. And they called that sacred, but sacred things don't require your erasure. They require your presence. And now you carry that presence again, Not as performance, not as knowledge, but as frequency. It shows up in how you breathe, how you protect your rhythm, how you no longer flinch at silence, how you don't shrink around loud people. The legacy isn't something you teach, it's something you transmit. Every time you don't explain yourself, every time you honor your body, every time you say no without softening the truth, you speak the prayer again, and it echoes louder than any pulpit ever could. That's what was really erased. Not a text, but a template for how to walk through the world unshaken. And now you are walking again, not as someone seeking light, but as someone remembering you carry it. And if they call that pride, let them, because what they call pride, you know as presence. What they call rebellion, you know as return. And what they fear as heresy, you now embrace as the most sacred act you've ever performed, being fully, unapologetically whole. You made it to the end. That already means something. It means the part of you that remembers, the part they couldn't erase, is alive again. You didn't just watch a video. You walked through a ritual of remembrance. You cracked the silence. You stepped outside the script. You held your breath long enough to hear the voice underneath the programming. And what you heard wasn't doctrine. It wasn't rebellion. It was you, unfiltered, untrained, unbroken. You remembered the sound of your soul before it was taught to whisper. And now the question becomes, what will you do with what you remember? Because remembrance isn't entertainment, it's activation. It's not enough to feel this. You must live it. This prayer can't just be recited. It must be embodied in your mornings, in your silence, in the way you respond to people who try to shrink you, in the way you guard your rhythm like it's sacred, because it is. The most radical thing you can do now is to protect this flame without apology. And maybe you don't have the perfect words yet. Maybe you still feel shaky. Maybe you still wonder if it's real. That's okay. You don't need to be certain. You just need to be willing. Willing to stay awake. Willing to honor the voice within. Willing to stop explaining your alignment to people who benefit from your disconnection. You're not here to argue anymore. You're here to radiate. And radiance doesn't need permission. So here's what I ask. Send this video to someone who's been silent for too long. Someone who's been strong in all the wrong ways. Someone who's starting to feel the cracks in the story they were given. They don't need a sermon. They need a mirror. And maybe this will be it. Comment below. What part of the script are you ready to lay down? What truth did your body recognize, even before your mind caught up? Don't just consume, contribute. Your words might be the spark that reignites someone else's fire. Like this video, if something in you shifted, even if you can't explain what, that tells the algorithm this isn't noise, this is awakening. Subscribe if you're done living on autopilot and ready to build a life that vibrates with your remembering. Not for followers, not for content, but for community. A quiet uprising of souls who are no longer willing to pretend they're powerless. You're not here to be strong, you're here to be real, and realness doesn't collapse, it returns. Welcome back. You never left. They just made you forget. Now, go remind the world what can't be erased.